welcome. Very happy to see you all, and very happy to welcome Dino Guastella as our guest speaker today. And Jack Metzger and I are going to facilitate, and Jack will now introduce Dino.
Yeah, Dustin Dino Guastella is Director of Operations of Teamsters Local 767, excuse me, 623. I know how sensitive people are about their numbers in Philadelphia. And he's a research associate at the Center for Working Class Politics. Some of you may know him. He's a regular contributor on politics and the working class for The Guardian, The Nation, Jacobin, and other places. So, Dino, why don't we begin by you telling us a little bit about yourself, your Teamsters Local, and also about the Center for Working Class Politics, which we don't know too much about.
Sure. Thanks, Jack. And thanks, Betsy, for organizing this and for inviting me. I'm happy to be here. About myself, my name is Dustin Dino Guastella. Please call me Dino. That's what everybody calls me, except my mother. So it's Mother's Day weekend. If you want to honor her, you can call me Dustin. My background is I was born in Flushing, Queens, to working class parents. My father's an electrician. My mother's a hairdresser. But I grew up in the Poconos, Pennsylvania, northeastern Pennsylvania, rural area. And then I went to college at Temple University and in Philadelphia and stayed in Philly as a result. Since then, I've worked in the labor movement exclusively, and now I'm with Teamsters Local 623, which is primarily a UPS local. One of our retired members is on the call, John Braxton. I'm glad you could make it out. And now we also have bus drivers as well. That 10% of our membership is now school bus drivers. So we are expanding. We are one of the more progressive locals in the country and one of the locals that's actually trying to organize and mobilize our membership. So I'm proud of my union and I'm proud of the work that we've been doing. The Center for Working Class Politics is a new center, relatively new center. I think we started it in 2018. I think that might be right. And the idea is basically we didn't think that there was a popular research center that did sort of popular polling on working class attitudes and actually examined what working class people think about economic, cultural, and social questions on a regular level and how those relate to politics. So our first major study was called Common Sense Solidarity. It was put out a few years ago and it made a big splash, got a bunch of headlines because we sort of said what I think everybody on this call already knows. Working class people are not actually these hopelessly conservative troglodytes that the media often makes them out to be. But the Democrats' particular appeals to them are missing the mark. And the way to actually appeal is in a sort of common sense way that talks about ways in which their jobs and their livelihoods would be protected and advanced and attack the immense wealth at the top of the society. So we produced a bunch of data to show what is a sort of common sense position, I think, on this call. And that's sort of what we do. I think, the Center for Working Class Politics often thinks of itself as telling a lot of New York Times readers things that ordinary people already know, but that's the job that we sort of see ourselves. And right now we're working on a couple big projects. One of them is surveying working class social and cultural attitudes for the past 50 or 60 years, actually, for the past 60 years. And the other one is a major study on contemporary economic policies that working class people favor, and by what degree do they favor them. So those two studies should be coming out sometime in the next couple months. We're trying to get them wrapped up now. And hopefully they'll make a splash and have a little bit of influence in and around the world of progressive politics.
Okay. Betsy?
Yeah. So I want to sort of set the stage with our big topic here of the electorate and the Democrats. So for a long time, there's been this debate within the Democratic Party between thinking that there could be what's been called a rainbow coalition of building the base of college-educated voters and combining that with people of color, and that would come out to a majority. And that was in the Clinton years, especially, that was the strategy. And then the other point of view, which has always been there, is that the Democratic Party needs to expand its base among working class people, usually defined as non-college educated people. And I would think that that debate is now over, that everybody pretty much understands that the Democrats cannot win nearly enough without greatly appealing to a lot more working class people of all races, but especially the white working class men. So are we reading that right? That uh, you're
Well, not just white working class men. I think the challenge has also now drifted into white working class men were sort of the canary in the coal mine for
mm,
what we call class de-alignment. Class de-alignment being the decoupling of the Democratic Party with its traditional working class base. And now we see that both Black and Latino men are drifting away from the Democratic Party, and a good number of Latino women as well are drifting away from the Democratic Party. So the problem is, what I like to say is the problem is not sectional. It's not rural workers, it's not white workers, it's class. It's the working class itself is moving. It's moving in different directions at different speeds, but it is moving away from the Democratic Party. And we know that decisively after this election.
yeah. So we know you've been thinking about this of how to reverse that trend a lot. So what do you think are the three most important things that the Democrats can do to change their fortunes among working class voters?
Sure. So I'm going to rattle off the three things, and then I'm going to go through why I think those three things are the most important and what specific challenges they're meant to address. So the three things easy are one, I think the Democratic Party and the broad left in general need to recruit working class candidates. It's imperative that working class people actually talk to working class people. And we know from the research that we've done that these candidates have a better time in working class districts. They do much better among working class voters. So that's number one. Number two, and this one I think is the tough one, especially for liberals to hear, the Democratic Party needs to ditch professional class values. And the Democratic Party holds very sacred a class aesthetic and a class value system that is very alien to most working class people and is condescending to most working class people. So ditching a certain democratic liberal elitism is really important. And we'll get into what that looks like and why. And then the third thing is embracing economic populism, right? And this is, again, something that some Democrats think they're doing some of the time, but I think there's a much more robust understanding of populism that we need to sort of mine. And it's a deep and rich vein in American politics that has a lot of potential for galvanizing a large and potentially majoritarian coalition behind it of people who are not traditionally thought of as on the left and people who are not traditionally thought of as liberals, right? So those are the three main things. Now, why are those the three things? I think the big challenge, I think there are three main challenges that the Democratic Party and the broad left face in reaching working class voters. The first of those challenges is sociological. The Democratic Party is not anymore, its functionaries, its staff members, its base, its messaging, its media, is not rooted in the labor movement. It's not rooted in working class communities. People who identify as liberal are sociologically different from the working class, and they are distanced from them. The social distance from them is pretty great. So much so that a lot of times professional class people don't really know how working class people think or speak or act and are very uncomfortable being around a lot of blue collar people. As a result of that, their affect and attempt to reach working class people on the campaign trail is very strained. It's stereotypical. It's false. It's canned, and it clearly demonstrates a lack of social knowledge of the class that they're trying to reach. So, how do you fix a sociological problem like that? Is a much more thoroughgoing question of organization, of embedding ourselves in the working class, of actually being the party of the working class. But in the short term, one way to sort of stop the bleeding and to help things is for the party to recruit working class candidates. I think the best example of this in the country was a candidate who didn't run as a Democrat named Dan Osborne out in on the West in Oregon. And his candidacy was predicated on the idea that he would be a populist who would challenge both the liberal elitism of the Democratic Party and the plutocratic elitism of the Republican Party. And he ran against an incumbent senator, and he did fantastically well. He outperformed every Democrat that ran in that race for the past 20 years or so. And he nearly won. He lost the election, but he nearly won. And this is a demonstration of a point we've been making a lot, which is that it's not that Dan Osborne was some miraculous speaker or, had the sort of golden oratory of some brilliant statesman. It's that Dan Osborne knew fundamentally the people he was trying to win. And he knew what issues moved them. He knew what appeals moved them. And he spoke a language that they understood. And he was able to relate to them in a way that very few professional class candidates could ever do so. And so he outperformed. And I think those kind of candidates have the ability to close the social gap between the Democrats and the working class. And in order to do that, I think the quick fix way is to start recruiting working class candidates, which the Democratic Party can do. The second thing, and this is much harder, and it's going to take a little bit of unpacking, and I want to hear what everybody has to say about this, is ditching what I'm going to call liberal professional class values. So the problem isn't only that the working class doesn't trust the Democrats on economic questions, or it's not only that the working class finds the Democratic Party condescending, it's also that the values of the Democratic Party are increasingly alien to the working class. And this is something that is going to be a real challenge for liberals to overcome, because I think many liberals hold very fiercely to some of their values, and they don't recognize them as professional class values, but they recognize them as universal values. And one of the things I think Marx always said that was really insightful was that when somebody presents their values as universal or their political values as universals, it's usually a mask for a sort of class interest. And I think that's what's going on here. So let's sort of unpack how the Democratic Party became dominated by liberal professional class values. I think the story starts in and around the 1990s, but accelerates all the way through to the contemporary moment. And that's basically that as the Democratic Party adopted its neoliberal free trade globalization economic program, it also adopted its professional class mobilization strategy, that it was going to go after highly educated, high income voters, particularly in the suburbs, but also in parts of the major cities, to supplement itself as it lost a huge chunk of its working class base while it was shipping jobs overseas and automating them. That economic transformation led to a rise in college-educated voters, which to the Democrats was a signal that they had a way to coast through every election. If they could merely win the college-educated and the high income, they could then be able to win without having to really appease the blue-collar voters who lost their jobs and who are suffering through the effects of deindustrialization. Well, what this did was it decreased the influence of labor in the Democratic Party, and it increased the influence of NGOs, nonprofits, and foundations, all of which are staffed by and organized through many professional class people. Those professional class people started becoming the congressional staffers, the revolving door of people in major seats of influence inside the Democratic Party. And their values, not the values of the Union Hall, started to define what the Democratic Party was, right? So now we have a party that is fundamentally and thoroughly trapped by those values and that way of thinking and that way of being. Breaking out of that is not easy. It's going to be very difficult. It's even difficult for many liberals to talk about it. I mean, there's huge animosity toward people who criticize wokeness or identity politics or any of the things that are held very closely and tightly by the professional class. But these things are alienating to workers. There's a recent political scientist by the name of Joan Kamphorst who just published a study just a few days ago showing that most working class people think the Democratic Party is not about economic progressive issues, but is about ultra-liberal cultural values, defunding the police, trans rights, getting rid of Christianity. These are things that have become associated with the Democratic Party. And I think we'll get into this in the Q&A, how much of that is the fault of liberals and how much of that is the fault of the right wing weaponizing what liberals say. But the fundamental point is that there is a value disconnect. And while liberals have embraced an egalitarian economic vision, or at least a somewhat egalitarian economic vision, they've done so at the exact same time that they've embraced a thoroughly elitist value proposition, right? A system of values that espouses a kind of virtue signaling and a condescension that many working class people pick up on. And so breaking with that is something that I think needs to happen. I think it's something that many Democrats are very uncomfortable with. It's actually much easier, I think, to tell Democrats to go out and recruit some working class candidates than it is to tell them that you have to shut up about certain issues that you hold really, really close to your chest. So we'll talk a little bit about that and what that looks like. But the good news is there's one huge opportunity for the left and the Democratic Party, which isn't going away. And that's the economic opportunity. Right now, obviously, we have a plutocratic government that's getting more plutocratic by the day, and we have intense inequality, rising inflation. Inflation is going to continue, and rising wage stagnation. In fact, working class wages are starting to decline pretty dramatically, especially for those who don't have college educations. All of this has led to a tremendous social rot. Obviously, the opioid spike has gone through the roof, mental health issues. There's a tremendous amount of alcoholism and drug abuse. There's homelessness. There's lots of crime. There's just general, so I mean, if you walk around cities like Philadelphia, you can see it all the time. There's a general social rot that has resulted from the failure of the economic system to provide for most people. Fixing that failure we cannot fix that failure without confronting the very rich and the corporations, right? The good news is working class people actually like this. They agree that the rich need to be confronted. They agree with taxing the very wealthy, and they agree with a populist political narrative. That is one that puts the little guy against the big oligarch and repeatedly states that they are the enemy. They are the enemy of progress. They are the enemy of democracy. They are the enemy of your wages, right? But that's not the same thing as a standard down the line economic progressivism. And so I'm going to sort of counterpose what an economic populism looks like that's slightly different from what is your garden variety progressivism. So what we know about most working class voters' economic interests is that they favor pre-distribution over redistribution. What does that mean? Well, redistribution is tax and spend programs, right? Welfare, the sort of classic social democratic, what we understand as the classic social democratic or liberal democratic model of fixing the problems in a capitalist system or fixing the problems in a market society. But many working class voters actually prefer what's called pre-distribution. That is the shaping and the planning of a market such that it meets better ends. So what does this look like in reality? Well, the demand for a higher minimum wage is through the roof among working class people. The demand for new social programs is not. In fact, not even a majority of working class people are comfortable with expanding certain social programs if they know it's going to increase the debt and increase the tax load. So we need to figure out what a populist economic program looks like, one that tackles questions that are sincere questions. And those questions are inequality, the taxation of the rich and redistribution of the taxation of the rich, real investment in the economy for good jobs, global trade, which right now we're seeing, it's undoubtedly true that many working class people like the fact that Trump went after the trade regime, the global free trade regime. Now, the way he's doing it is chaotic and may cause economic disaster. But Democrats were asleep at the wheel for years on trade without recognizing that this was going to come and bite them, that eventually somebody's going to take on globalization and win an election on it. So we have to address trade. We have to address reindustrialization. And fundamentally, and this is the one that I think many progressives are a bit surprised by, and I'll get into why this is, we have to address the national debt. And this is a populist issue. We have to figure out how to address the national debt. There's an easy way to do it, of course, it's taxing the very rich. But we need to figure out and actually talk about balancing the budget in ways that actually help the economy and help grow the wages of working class people. So a populist economic program doesn't look exactly like what we've understood as a progressive economic program over the years. But a populist economic program has a lot of potential. and it's not going to go away. The potential for populism is going to stick around because wages aren't increasing and people are feeling very precarious. So again, if we go back to what are the three things that they can do, they can start to rebuild the social closeness with the working class by actually recruiting working class candidates. The Democrats can start to actually embody the values of working class people rather than their professional class staffers. And three, they need to embrace a genuine economic populism, one that comes from the grassroots and one that is fundamentally American rather than the economic progressivism, or worse, the neoliberal variety, which are sort of products of the professional class that they are around. So that's my short version of what I think the Democrats can do. I think we'll get into a bit more of what that means in the Q&A. So hopefully that was enough for now.
Yeah, that was awesome. I think Jack, you're muted. Yep. Uh-oh. Do we have
Jack, you're on mute. I don't know if you can hear us.
Dennis, we're not doing audience Q&A yet. Jack and I have some questions for Dino, but Jack, do I have the power to unmute you?
Yeah, I just asked him to unmute.
Yeah, Jack.
Jack, are you hearing us?
I'm hearing you. Can you hear
Okay,
me?
Okay,
there
there we
you
go.
go. There you
Okay,
go.
sorry about that.
All right, we lost you a bit.
Thanks, Dino. That was great. A couple of things. One, how realistic is it to have working class candidates, given that people have a job and they're not a lawyer, they're not a billionaire, millionaire. This is very practically difficult for working class people to, particularly those below the median wage, to run for office. Is there a practical way to do this? And I guess I would count too as who counts as a working class candidate? Would union staff like you count? Would teachers count? People have a little more flexibility with their time, but are professionals in a sense also.
Yeah, so I'll take the first question, Jack. Practically, it is feasible, and there are two institutions that can do it. The first is the party itself, right? There's a tremendous amount of money that they're happy to spend on all sorts of things. There's no reason why they can't spend it on stipends for candidates that they think are promising and candidates that should be running, right? Osborne is actually starting a PAC that's called the Working Class Heroes Fund that is designed to do exactly this and nothing but this, basically pooling money for working class candidates that have talent and have the ability to run, but simply can't take off the time from work to compete in a major election. The other big institution is the labor movement itself, right? The labor movement has sort of fallen out of the habit of recruiting candidates from its own ranks, but the strongest, during the labor movement's peak, the strongest unions would do this very regularly. In 1946, the CIO ran something like 16 congressional candidates across the country just by their own, by the strength of their own work. That's not counting the dozens and dozens and dozens of union members that were recruited by their local unions, right? That's just the Federation that did that. So the labor movement, weak as we are and small as we are, we still have the capacity to do stuff like that. We still have the capacity to recruit members who are promising and who have the abilities and the skills to run for office, and have them, basically on the union's dime, do this so that they can have a living while they're campaigning, right? So I think there's a practical way around it. Whether or not there's political will to do it is a totally different story. But there is a practical solution to the problem of getting working class candidates to run. The other side of it, I'll say, is that politically we know it works. We have plenty of evidence that working class voters like working class candidates. There was a very long attempt in the 1990s by political scientists to demonstrate that people didn't vote for working class candidates because they thought they were stupid. But now we have about 30 years worth of evidence showing that that's not true at all. And it was, basically a professional class bias infecting the research. So now there's perfectly good reason. There's only the practical problems to solve and the obvious problem of political will. So that's on the side of, can we recruit working class candidates? We absolutely can. Who would count as a working class person? So the Center for Working Class Politics has measured working class 18 different ways to Sunday to figure out what the best solution to this perennial conundrum is. The best solution is the metric used by this sociologist named Eric Olin Wright, which is to say, do you have low skills, low autonomy, and no supervisory abilities at work or functions at work? If you have low skills, low autonomy, and no supervisory functions at work, you would count as part of the working class. By that metric, we get something like 56 to 60% of the American population qualifies. Just above that, which is to say you have high skills, low autonomy, and no supervisory capacities, you add that, you get 75% of the country is working class, right? The challenge for using that is that it's very hard to find people's personal skills, autonomy, and supervisory functions at work. So we've tested a number of proxy models, and believe it or not, non-college educated works quite well. It's not a one-to-one, but it's very good and comes very close to capturing the same kind of qualities that your work life captures. So non-college educated works for a lot of political applications. It's not perfect, certainly, but it does work. And I always argue the non-college educated are already the majority of the working class, regardless of your calculations. They're going to be the majority of the working class. So if you can win the non-college educated, chances are you can win most of the working class, right? So it's important to talk about the non-college educated working class. Who would count as a working class candidate? I mean, I think that's an open and subjective question, right? There are people on the fringes, like you said, union staffers who have a sort of sociological closeness to workers and have been embedded in working class life for a very long time, even though they have high skills, autonomy, and supervisory functions at work. They might be considered working class. I think this is an affective question, a subjective question, and it depends on the race, right? It depends on what race and what the stakes are. For instance, there's a candidate, a congressional, he's no longer a candidate, a congressman out in Western Pennsylvania named Chris DeLuzio. He was a Navy man. He was a college graduate, but he was a staffer, I think, for the steelworkers for a number of years. He is by far, he's more of a working class candidate than many other people with his background, right? He speaks to working class people, he speaks about their interests, and he wins in Trump country among non-college educated workers. So there's a candidate that I think it'd be reasonable to say, despite the fact that it doesn't fit the strict parameters, is a working class candidate, right? So that's I guess the best way to sort of get around that quagmire.
Okay, I want to come back to one other thing with the populist message, but you already answered one of the questions we were going to ask about the definition of the working class, what you and the center, how you do it. But I also asked about money. One of the things that the exit polls and the fancy exit polls give us is people below $50,000. They count as working class. One Larry Bartels, the one political scientist, was his definition, and that 50,000 has to move up because of inflation and things like that. But in this last election, for the first time, people making less than $50,000 voted just by 3 points, but voted for the Republican candidate, and that has not happened hardly ever, if ever, in the past. So I reserve the right to ask one more question about the populist message, but how do you factor in money? You say the low economy is part of your definition, right?
Yeah. So in one of our recent studies, we did non-college to figure out the social and cultural views of working class voters. We sorted them by non-college and less than $75,000 household income, and we did $75,000. I know 50,000 is the number some of the press are doing, but that simply doesn't capture electricians. It doesn't capture a huge chunk of the high skilled working class. And there's no reason why they should not be considered working class, especially if they live on the East Coast. Chances are they make more than $100,000 a year. So we've tried to integrate income as part of the definition because it's important to capture a lot of high income, non-college educated people who are workers, who literally work for a living, but would be missed in the $50,000 cutoff.
Right, right, good. And the last question I'm going to ask in response is, what do you think about a wealth tax? And I want to preface this with something that's been very frustrating to me. I looked it up, and the top 1% has more net wealth than all personal income and corporate profits combined. And we don't tax it. We tax local property, but that has been raised by Sanders and Warren in the Democratic Party. Where does that fit in the populist program? The polls, as you probably know very well, in the high 60s, low 70s.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is the key to how you make an argument about balancing the budget. I honestly think the only way for us to, there's two things. One, the only way for us to restore growth in the American economy is to attack the wealth. And this is something that's often not talked about, but it is simply a fact that the American economy is stagnating because very rich people aren't investing their money. They're saving their money. Their money is going into Wall Street and it's going into savings. As a result of that, there's less and less money circulating in the real economy. We know if you give working class people money, what do they go out and do? They spend it. They put it in the real economy. But that's not true for the very rich. What they do is they hoard it. They keep it from the real economy. And so the only way to fix economic growth is to start taxing the wealth of the very wealthy. Secondly, all of our problems with working class voters really started going downhill south fast with NAFTA. What happened with NAFTA at the same time is that we managed to create loopholes for the very wealthy to hide as much of their money in offshore accounts as they possibly could. So a quick statistic to demonstrate how badly this has gotten. Back in the year 1996, we had about 66 billionaires in the United States. After NAFTA, and especially after the China entered the World Trade Organization, we legalized normal trade relations with China. We jumped up from 66, just 10 years later. This is after about 10 million factory jobs have left. 10 years later, we jumped up to 298 billionaires. Today, it is 748 billionaires in the United States. That's 7 million factory jobs lost and 748 billionaires gained. That's an incredible amount of wealth redistribution from the bottom to the top. And the only way to fix it is to redistribute it from the top back down to the bottom. Okay. But the challenge is people are very afraid of taxation. And they're not wrong to be afraid of taxation. Working class people are actually overtaxed in the current system. As you note, there's no wealth taxes, yet there's taxes on property, which is effectively a wealth tax on the working class, but no wealth tax on the very rich, right? So how do you fix this? I think there's a reason why there's tremendous tax skepticism among working class people, and they know that it eats into their income, and they know that Republicans will at least give them maybe a tax break, which is potentially something of a little bit of an income boost, right? Mm-hmm. At the same time, what the Democrats have done as a substitute for raising taxes is basically increasing credit. And this has happened at both the federal level and at the personal level. So what we've seen under Bill Clinton was the relaxing of credit so that more and more people could have access to credit, right? This eventually created the bubbles that created the 2008 financial crisis. And then how did we fix the 2008 financial crisis? Well, we used a ton of federal debt to pump the economy full of more sort of credit in order to fix the problem. Well, what we've done is create a massive debt bubble at the top of the American economy that has no way of being solved without taxing the wealth at the top of the American economy. So we have to fix both of these problems. And the only way to do it is to attack the very wealthy. So I think there's a beautiful populist road for anybody who wants to take it that fixes all of these problems, which says we need to restore American economic growth. We need to fix the tremendous amount of inequality, and we need to balance the budget. The only way to do all three of those things, is to go after the wealth that is hiding in giant clouds above us, a million feet in the sky.
Yeah. Okay, Betsy, your turn.
All right. Well, do we want to talk, or maybe we've covered it. Do we want to talk about the definition of working class and the current voter breakdown?
Yeah, we sort of did
We
did
kind of
that.
did, that's what I was
You're
saying.
the-
Is there anything else in there? But I like the question at the bottom there. So it's the Families Party poll. Core MAGA is a fifth of the working class. 2/5 are hardcore Democrats. What's going on with the other 2/5 who are not politically affiliated in either direction?
Yeah, that's I mean, those are the political kingmakers, right? Those are the people
That's
who
right.
manage to swing every election.
That's
And that's the group that I think people need to be focusing on for persuasion, right? These
Yeah.
are people who are likely, if you took a random one of those people in that other 2/5 of the working class, their views are likely. They have some mix of progressive economic views. They probably want to raise the minimum wage. They're probably comfortable with taxing the rich, and they probably don't like globalization and trade. And they have a mix of moderate cultural and social views. They might be a little bit more conservative on abortion than a liberal is. They might be a little bit more conservative on religious views than a liberal is. But they're not hardcore right wingers. They're not out to establish a sort of right wing government, and they're winnable. They're persuadable. It's that group that I think is the most important for people to start thinking about how you win, right? And if we can persuade them, we can build a genuine legislative majority, not just a presidential election, but a legislative majority, which is what you need to actually fix all of the problems that we're trying to fix.
Great. All right.
Okay, well,
I think it might be time to move on to the questions about identity politics, which you're going to start, right, Jack?
yeah, let's do that. Uh, Dino, you've written that Democrats have overemphasized identity politics, excluding a more class-based politics and more universalistic policies. I broadly agree with that, and Betsy doesn't. So, Betsy, you asked the question.
All right. You don't want to ask you. Okay, cool. So I think that this is a Republican talking point. Primarily. I mean, I agree with you, Dino, that there is a different approach to race and gender issues by class, and there certainly is a, you know, a elitist extreme oversensitivity to what words are used and so forth. So I think I agree with most of what you've said about it, but I think that Republicans have a playbook that I think of as raising moral panics and to win voters. And they do it over and over again, and it seems to work every time. They seem to be very good at it. So to me, the Democrats are so into identity politics is is the next one in the line that started with, welfare queens and there's a war on Christmas. They make up this stuff that's not factually based. And then get people alarmed, low information people alarmed, and voting for Republican candidates. So to me, like the ad that was so influential of Kamala Harris cares about they, them, Trump cares about you. That's like that's a that's one of the it's a Republican moral panic campaign. And Harris didn't mention transgender issues and, avoided mentioning her own race, much less anything else about racism. I think kind of to a depressing degree, just stayed away from some really substantive inequality, racial and gender inequality issues. So I don't think that she lost votes because of anything she actually said about culture war issues. I think the Republicans played that, and now that their rumor has has circulated so that it becomes a sort of a mainstream view. So I think there are ways to raise gender inequities and race inequities that are not alienating to those swing voters who often do have values of fairness. And so anyway, I'm just curious what you think is the actual degree of Democratic focus on race and gender issues, and what is the ideal degree of focus?
Right. So you raise a number of really good points, Betsy. The first is that we actually analyzed all of Kamala's speeches, and not just all of Kamala's speeches, all of the 2022 midterm speeches of all congressional Democratic candidates. What we found was there wasn't a lot of wokeness. There was not a lot of wokeness in their campaigns. But yet the Democratic brand is completely sort of defined by these identity politics issues, right? What explains this? Well, your explanation is, well, it's all a very effective campaign on the part of the right. There's some truth to that, but there's a kernel of truth to the other side of the story, which is that the organizations of the left, who are not politicians, who are not democratically accountable, and who are not part of small d democratic politics, actually do embrace the values that the Republicans fearmonger around, and they have a lot of power inside the media and a lot of power in the Democratic Party. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to decouple that liberal media sphere from the liberal Democratic Party. And the inability of decoupling those things is precisely part of the problem. People associate what is said on MSNBC with what is Kamala Harris's campaign or what is Joe Biden's campaign, regardless of whether or not the candidates themselves embrace those views, right? And I think the challenge of fixing the brand is, what people call the Democratic Party brand, is really what people are after when they say there's too much identity politics, there's too much of this, there's too much of that, right? Now, you're right that this does not mean ditching any discussion of racism or ditching any discussion of gender or ditching, and just ignoring all of those issues. But it's how you approach them, right? There's a working class way of approaching them, and then there's a professional middle class way of approaching them. And I think because the levers of power are pulled by media liberals and other influential party people who are completely divorced from the working class, the professional class lever is pulled over and over again and yanked, to the point of it breaking, whereas the working class level is hardly ever touched, right? Whenever somebody does polling on this, and they ask questions that are broadly about solidarity and bringing people together and wages, you'll find that there's a broad majority that agree with liberal values on these questions. But the way that they're often framed from the left is in ways that repel people. So how do we fix that? It's not an easy thing. It's not an easy solution, because these organizations, these foundations are very powerful. Yeah. And one thing we were talking about before we got on was, one reason the ideology of, the sort of more poisonous brand of identity politics ideology is so effective in the academy and in the foundation world is because it is a means of status jumping. It is a means of professional class people using their virtue signaling to jump status in their own organizations and in their own lives. But their lives are so very different from the lives of working class people that what it looks like is what it is. It's an attempt at a condescending show of I'm better than you. And in a foundation setting, that helps you get a job or a grant or a better position. But in a democratic political setting, it helps you repel a ton of blue collar people who find it really off-putting, the way that you're talking down to them and the way that you're sort of trying to demonstrate your betterness, your moral superiority. So I think we have to grapple with the fact that this isn't just the right-wing boogeyman. The reason as you said, Betsy, it seems to work every time. The reason it works every time is because there is a heel. There is a heel for the right to use. And that heel happens to have a lot of power in the Democratic Party and in liberal politics. And if we can't attack that heel on our own and say, that sort of elite liberalism doesn't actually speak for those of us who vote for the left. If we can't do that, then somebody else will, and they'll do it very effectively. And I think the right has done it very effectively.
So can you spin out what would it sound like, a culturally working class, appealing to those swing voters, way of talking, of speaking up against racism, institutionalized racism, against transphobia and sexism?
I mean, this isn't rocket science. It's what Dr. King said. It's what Bayard Rustin said. It's what A. Philip Randolph said. I mean, these people knew how to win white workers in a much less progressive time over to the appeals of the civil rights movement. And they did it by saying, if we are not able to communicate across skin color, across religion, across gender, if we are not able to come together, then we will all suffer as a result of it, right? That's an appeal that doesn't blame white people. It's not an appeal that says, you poor white schmuck who lives in Appalachia who just lost his job, you're the cause of racism in America, right? The appeals that I see coming from liberals do that. They point the finger at young white men in particular and say, you're the cause of XYZ problem. You're the cause. Whereas King and Randolph and Rustin all pointed the finger upward. They said, no, they're the cause. They're the cause. You need to be part of the solution, right? And I think that's the way in which we have to talk about these issues and engage these issues. And when we poll these issues, even when we talk in this way with our coworkers and people, it's far more effective than the alternative. Far more effective than the name and blame, than the guilt tripping and all the other ways in which progressive politics has sort of adopted a kind of backward way of trying to get at answers to these questions.
The place I see that finger pointing upwards instead of out at white working class voters, the best right now is the organization Showing Up for Racial Justice. Does that really, that's their line on that is just exactly as you said. So
Okay, I'm gonna switch here a little bit. Dino, you recently wrote a provocative piece in The Nation defending United Auto Workers President Sean Fain's support for Trump's tariffs. You, like Fain, support the goal of bringing back manufacturing, and have written quite a lot about that, and defend tariffs as a necessary tool toward that end. Fain, from what I've heard, also makes a good case for targeted tariffs as one aspect of a national strategy in auto. But why mix that up with the wildly incompetent and imperial bullying array of tariff policies of the Trump administration? That may be a somewhat biased question.
No, it's a good question. I can't speak for Sean Fain. I can't. I don't know what was going through his head. My purpose was, in saying that what Sean is arguing for is economically correct, and I think we need to be honest about the fact that there must be an exit from globalization. We have over-globalized the American economy to the degree that you have to start winding down these massive free trade deals. Well, what's that going to look like? It's going to look like tariffs. It's not going, I don't think Trump's tariffs are the way to go. I think they're wrong. And Sean has said as much as well, that the broad array of tariffs that Trump has put forward are largely going to hurt working people. They're going to raise prices without actually reshoring manufacturing for the most part. Targeted tariffs are the way to go. Targeted tariffs in steel and auto and in other really important sectors where we can actually grow the domestic industry. But the important part of saying this stuff is that so many liberals have immediately jumped on the bandwagon that it's not simply Trump's tariffs that are bad, but all attempts at deglobalizing are doomed to fail. All attempts at trying to reshore manufacturing are doomed to fail. Any attempt at delinking the United States economy from these massive, massive chains, supply chains, is automatically some form of evil messing with the market that we just cannot abide by. And I think that's folly. We need to be able to say, no, there's a right way and a wrong way to do this. The way that Trump is doing it is the wrong way, but there is a right way to do this. There's a right way to decouple the American economy from hyperglobalization, shorten supply chains, reshore manufacturing jobs. By doing nothing else, we can reopen about 50,000 auto worker jobs in the next 5 years by doing nothing else but tariffs. And there's much more to be done, but that's 50,000 high-wage union jobs that would be reshored in an instant if we were effective at doing this. So I think Democrats need to get through their head that tariffs can be very effective tools if used intelligently. Biden knew this, but somehow the entire party forgot it as soon as Trump got in office. Biden raised tariffs on auto by 100% from China. Biden raised tariffs across the board on different auto. So Fain is being consistent here.
But he had subsidies on the other side of that.
Yes, he did. Biden did much better than Trump in that he had subsidies as well for rebuilding manufacturing in the United States. But Fain is being consistent here. He's said all along, we are going to support these auto tariffs regardless of who's in office. We're not going to break with them. We're going to stick with them. And I think he's right on that.
But if we have a resurgence of manufacturing in the US, it wouldn't mostly be union, high wage, unionized jobs. I think that the new factories would get built in the right to work states and would be terrible jobs. So I think sort of I agree with you on some very narrow categories, but the idea that that it's gonna be economically positive for working class people if we greatly expand US manufacturing seems like a pipe dream.
Well, it might be a pipe dream. I don't know what we don't know what the limit is. And nobody knows what the limit is. That is how many jobs can be reshored, how many factories can be reopened through industrial policy, not just tariffs, but a genuine industrial policy. Not what Trump is doing, but a policy of tariffs plus investments. Whether or not they get built in right to work states, well, these are political questions. If it were the case that there was a majority of people in Congress who had a thoughtful approach to industrial policy, it's possible that you can put sticks as well as carrots in industrial policy legislation that would ensure that these jobs are decently waged, that Biden did this exactly with his Chips and Science Act, that these jobs had to be decent wage jobs. They had to be family sustaining wages. They need to meet a number of social criteria. They had to have a certain number of certain days off, and they need to stay out of the agreement for no messing with the union election. Stay out of any union election. You can't try to mess with a union election. If the workers want a union, they're allowed to have a union. Well, Biden was able to build that into industrial policy. I think that's perfectly reasonable to say that any future Democratic president with a majority in Congress can build it into industrial policy as well, if they agree with the premise, right? So our job is to convince them that the premise makes sense.
Okay.
And your other point is about how feasible is it, whether it's a pipe dream, and what the new jobs are going to look like. Look, I think we need to bring back manufacturing even under the conditions of automation, even under the conditions of sort of the chance of them being put in places that don't have strong union rights. And the reason why is that we need to shorten supply chains. During COVID, it should have been apparent to everybody the fact that the United States doesn't make anything. The fact that we were completely incapable of making masks for our own population. That is a problem that isn't just a problem of jobs. It's a problem of national self-sufficiency and the inability of our government has effectively said we are going to let the rest of the world make everything, and our job is to be the world's consumers. Well, that comes up to a real hard stop when there are crises, economic crises, pandemic crises, any sort of crisis. You're going to find that if you can't make things, your country will come grinding to a halt. There's another important reason why we need to shorten supply chains and bring manufacturing jobs home. If we want to rebuild our infrastructure, it makes no sense for us to ship prefabricated steel components from China all the way across the world to be installed in a bridge in Pittsburgh that had a steel foundry that closed down 3 years ago. It makes absolutely no sense economically, morally, socially to do that. Instead, reopen the steel foundry, even if it means it's going to have 30% less steel workers, reopen the steel foundry in Western Pennsylvania and build those parts there to be used right on site. That's not only better for the environment, it's better socially and it's better morally. It makes sense to do this. So even I have yet to hear a good argument against the idea that we should reindustrialize the United States. All of the arguments come down to, well, can we do it? Is it cost effective? And well, actually, all these jobs are going to be automated anyway. We don't know. We don't know. And the only way you can know is if you try. If we believe in the idea that the country should be economically self-sufficient, should have economic sovereignty over its economic policies, then we need to have manufacturing jobs. If we can convince people that that's the case, We need to reshore a ton of blue collar jobs. I think those jobs can be union. I think it's a lot easier for those jobs to become union under a Democratic president and under a system of progressive industrial policy than it is to allow and cede the ground of all industrial policy to the right and allow the right to take hold of the narrative of manufacturing.
Betsy, do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, I was thinking you have another topic you want to bring up, but we do
Well,
want to
yeah.
open it up. Why don't we just, yeah, why don't you ask one more of your
Well,
questions?
yeah, this is a
and then,
somewhat different area.
Yeah,
Dino.
and then we'll open it up. I know there's some really good questions already in the chat and people are eager to.
I just want to open this up, and if you can answer briefly, you've written critically about what you call welfareism and counterposed it to increasing workers' power and to making things that provide higher wages. What do you include within welfareism, and why are you skeptical of it?
Right. So by welfareism, what I mean is the idea that we are going to appease working class voters by more cash assistance programs, right? Programs that directly say, here's a check. We're not interested in reorganizing the economy. We're not interested in giving you a decent job, but we understand it kind of sucks that, your factory lost. So here's a check, and that'll be compensation. I think people rightly find this to be a pretty humiliating way of dealing with social policy. And it's why people are skeptical of a lot of welfare programs. Now, that's not to say that we should go down the Clinton route of destroying welfare as we know it. There are tons of good and reasonable forms of social programs that need to be maintained that have nothing to do with work and that shouldn't have work requirements attached to them. But it is to say that the left shouldn't think that they can simply cut a check for all of the social problems that a bad economy has caused. And there are some on the left who think that you can simply automate all the jobs and have universal basic income, or maybe we can have negative income tax and give people $1,000 check every few weeks. These things, I think, are going to fail politically. I think you need to demonstrate. People find inherent self-worth in participating in the economy, in being a part of the economy, a productive member of the economy. It is very difficult to say we're going to get rid of that and replace it with cash. And you can use that cash on Amazon or whatever, and that's going to be your new life. You just get a check and you spend it. So I think we need to break out of the mold of thinking we can solve political problems by cutting checks. We need to, it's much more aggressive and much more progressive to say we want to plan the economy. We want to change the nature of the economy fundamentally from top to bottom, such that people have decent jobs, such that people wake up and they like the thing that they do, and they feel like they are productive members of society. And as a result of giving into society, they are able to take the social fruits from society, rather than a situation where a bunch of high-income workers are paying high taxes for a bunch of people who we've effectively said are redundant in the social world, and that they're just going to collect checks because we don't want to deal with them revolting against the system that we've created. And that's sort of what I mean about getting away from welfareism.
Okay.
All right.
Betsy?
Yeah, let's allow people to unmute yourselves and either put questions in the chat, which we can read aloud, or use the little hand raise function to say you want to say something. Any hands going up? Or I can read some of the, yeah, Dennis, and you had a nice juicy question in the chat too.
I have several. I don't know if there's time for it, but I will try. I know it might.
Pick one for now, Dennis, and let's see if
Okay, well, okay, so one thing is, so instead of tariffs, I think we should support the industries that we want to make local. And I know he didn't do it the right way, but Obama did this with GM, and I think we can build the economy, but I don't think we should focus on economic growth. That's the other thing. You can't, what we really should be doing is providing universal basic services. And that will employ people. And yes, we have to have manufacturing, but I think universal basic services like healthcare for everyone, college education for everyone who wants it and is qualified, and things like that. The things that people can't afford. That's redistribution of income. I'm trying to squeeze it all together, but that's the best I can do in a short time.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that the question is, what do we want in a good society? I agree with you, Dennis. In general, I want all of those things in a good society. The question is, how do you get there, and what is the political program that actually mobilizes a majority of workers? And right now, people are reeling from globalization, and I think there's a reason to say we actually do need to support tariffs. We do need to say the country needs to decouple itself from the over globalized nature of supply chains. There's no real way around doing that without saying we're going to erect some protectionary walls. They don't have to look like Trump's, but I think there's good, sensible economic and political reasons to say we're in favor of some mercantile protectionism.
All right, let's hear from somebody else. Anybody want to raise your hand? Or I see Erica has a long thing in the chat, and Rachel. Do either of you want to say them out loud or have them be read?
Allison's hand is up.
Oh, and okay, I guess I'm not seeing the hands. Yeah, Allison, what's on your mind?
Yeah, I just have thank you, Dino, for everything. This is really interesting and compelling, and I agree with pretty much everything that you said. With the pre-distribution, I love the way that you talked about that. One thing that I've thought about for a long time and struggled to sort of articulate is this sort of setup where a lot of educated left Democrat people, when they want to propose a solution, they propose agencies, even the social services that Dennis just talked about, which are highly corruptible, but also bossy and a nuisance and potential place of power. And welfare is a great example that in its actual implementation, it's not really handing people checks, it's intervening in people's lives and telling them what to do, all the things that like Democrats have a bad name about, right? So restructuring the economy, reducing the power of those with wealth, focusing our attention always on the top and trying to break down inequality is going to be, I think, a much more successful path to success than fixing problems once they happen or requiring government to grow to solve a problem, especially when that is associated with corruptible people that are condescending. So that's, yeah, just basically wanted to make that comment and thank you for your talk.
Nice, Allison. And I see Teamster something behind you.
Yeah.
Yes, I was not a Teamster myself, but I worked in their office for a few years and local 206 in Eugene when I was a grad student, or
Oh, nice.
before I was a grad student, actually. I was like between jobs. And so, yes, I have a lot of fondness for Teamsters. They were very good to me and great people. Yeah.
That's great to hear. Yeah, to your point about pre-distribution, I mean, this is one of the things I think needs to be internalized. A good example of pre-distribution policies that are totally off the radar of the progressive left, but are genuinely populist. There's a congresswoman out in Oregon, actually, Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez, who proposed this bill called the Right to Repair Bill. This bill has become popular among a number of working class and sort of labor-oriented Congress people. And the polling on it that we've seen is it is wildly popular among non-college educated voters. What is the bill? The bill basically says if you buy an expensive piece of equipment, you have the right to repair it. The company cannot force you to bring it to their dealership to buy their parts and to buy their tools in order to repair your John Deere tractor. Here's a perfect example of populist redistribution. This has nothing to do with creating a new agency. It has nothing to do with handing out a check. It has everything to do with working class people being able to take control of their literal means of production and fix them themselves, right? These are the kinds of policies that directly attack the corporate class. John Deere is furious about this. They're lobbying about it all the time. Yet many, many people, especially even Trump voters, would go for a policy like that because it's a policy that shows you're out to help the little guy against the big corporations, and you're not going to do anything to make their life harder or more difficult or more confusing and bureaucratic.
All right, you got your hand up, Erica?
Yeah. Um, I made several points about the LGBTQ Two-Spirit Plus uh, part of our fabric in the chat. But what I want to bring here verbally is that when we're talking about kind of what was the turning point of getting the Democrats way, off the line and stuff. And I certainly agree that globalization and Clinton's policies were huge in that. But honestly, I really date it to the election of Ronald Reagan because his first act was to bust the Air Traffic Controllers Union, and that was a big strike. I mean, I remember it very well. It was in the news day after day after day, and he just like wham, just did it. And I observed him building, or in hindsight, I didn't quite have this analysis at the time, but him building on the right to work, the so-called right to work laws that were being passed, particularly in the southern, formerly segregated or currently segregationist states, which were racially based, where it was racism in the form of those laws. So, and of course, anti-union. I mean, absolutely anti-union. And right to work was was one of those phrases that is inaccurate. So I'm just curious, Dino, because you didn't reference anything before Clinton's policies, and how do you see the progression of this stuff before Clinton?
Yeah, so I maybe wasn't clear. When I pinpointed Clinton, I was talking about the transformation in the Democratic Party, not the transformation in the country as a whole. I think effectively what we see from the 70s through Clinton is, in the 70s you had a major economic crisis of stagflation. The right came up with an economic solution to it, right? Reaganism was an economic solution to stagflation. And the solution was break the backs of the unions, pump use the Federal Reserve to bring down interest rates, stimulate investment, and cut taxes, right? That was a solution that worked for a period of time. It did bring inflation down. It did increase economic growth at the cost of the entire labor movement, right? So what was it that Clinton did? Clinton said, okay, can we maintain the Reaganomics and win back some of our working class base? And that was Clinton's innovation. And I think Clinton's unique innovation was adding free trade, right? Saying, let's keep a lot of the Reaganite tax regime. Let's keep a lot of the Reaganite way of approaching interest rates, and let's add into it free trade. So I probably didn't speak clearly, Erica. When I pinpoint Clinton, I pinpoint him because he was the transformation on the Democratic side of the aisle. Before him, no Democrat would embrace the kind of economic policies that he wholeheartedly embraced. And he really transformed the Democratic Party's economic program from being one of basically LBJ. It was still kind of an LBJ program through the 1970s and into the 80s. And he was the one that finally broke the back of that and changed it.
Great. Thank you, Dino.
I see your hand, Bob, but first, why don't we have Claude? Why don't you ask the question that you put in the chat?
Sure. Dino, first of all, thank you for your generous time and enthusiasm around making your points and your claims tonight. It's as Allison said, really compelling and thought-provoking. So in this question, what caught my attention in the three buckets or categories that you identified earlier in your talk was about the class de-alignment. And so my question is, what have you seen are some approaches to reverse the class de-alignment trends in local and state democratic politics? So like, how can we neutralize classism in candidate development? So for me, part of what I think I observe is like the the concept of running for office has been romanticized, glamorized, and made to be a professional class activity. And how can we bring it back closer to the people?
Yeah, so examples that I've seen, I think the best example that I've seen, and it's an uneven example, but it's a path forward, is the New Jersey AFL-CIO's Union Candidates Program. So the New Jersey AFL-CIO has elected over 1,000 candidates from their own unions over the past, I think, maybe 15, 20 years. It's an uneven program because obviously the New Jersey AFL-CIO is a very large organization, and it's not exactly like, laser focused on the kinds of issues that I think can solve all the problems of working class New Jerseyans. But their tremendous success is getting union members elected. And they've done a fantastic job of getting union members elected at all levels of government and all levels of skill in the working class, from, low skill manual workers through electricians, through college educated workers in unions. They've gotten them elected in important positions throughout the state. So that's an example that I think if people are interested in how candidate recruitment happens, how these candidates can be developed and run for office, the New Jersey AFL-CIO's Union Candidates Program is probably the best in the country at doing this.
Thank you. Excellent.
Okay, Bob, what's on your mind?
Thank you. Thank you for that great presentation. So my family comes from northeastern Pennsylvania, like yours, Dino, and worked in the mines there as well. So I coming from Appalachia, I think about the coal industry every day, and I'm interested in friends there still working in the mines. I'm interested to know what you think about what we do with coal and how we deal with that. A lot of people, when we talk about it, think that we're defending jobs, and it's true that we are, but I think a lot of times we're defending a way of life, not employment in the mines, which is incredibly bad for the environment and incredibly bad for our health. This is the last piece of coal I pulled out of a mine where I left the industry. I always keep it close by so I remember. The other question, which is kind of related to that, actually, I have a lot of friends who are Trump supporters. And on paper, I look like the Trump demographic, no college education, older guy, white guy, kind of socially conservative, I get called. A lot of my friends, you can't argue with them facts. And the Dems make this factual, fact-based argument. But more and more of my friends, especially back home, are saying, look, I'm just waiting for the rapture to take me out of this before things get worse. Right? Or they're going to be moved by somebody who is like more morally based or religiously based than based in facts and politics. And I'm just wondering what you think about that as well. And they are related because I'm talking about a specific group of people in a specific location. Thank you.
Bob, that's a great question. I'm going to and I want to hear your honest answer. I'm going to spit the coal question back at you because I genuinely am at a loss. I think you're entirely right. Part of the defense of coal is about defending the social world that miners live in. It's not about defending the jobs. Obviously, we know they're terrible jobs. And it's not about defending, this industry, which is a terrible industry. But how do you solve that problem? That's a question I'd like to hear what you have to say on. In terms of how to appeal to people on an emotional register, I think this is a huge problem. I think there are very few people, as the Democratic Party has become more and more secular, there are very, very few people in the party that have a moral vision that can speak to especially religious working class voters. And the ability to emotionally move people often has less to do with the right policies and a fact-oriented perspective, and more to do with the emotional register in which you're making the case. We've learned through some of our research that it doesn't matter what the policy you're putting forward is. When it comes to certain issues, not all issues, but when it comes to certain issues, it doesn't matter what the progressive policy you're putting forward is. It will gain more support if you simply talk about jobs and way of life in talking about the progressive policy. It's by hitting that emotional register about preserving working class jobs and way of life, it somehow increases the support for a number of different progressive programs, right? We know that that's true. getting candidates and getting leaders on the left to think in that emotional register and that moral register is very difficult. There's not a lot of practice in it. They don't come from, many people on the left don't come from religious backgrounds anymore. I do, I'm a practicing Catholic, but there are very few practicing Catholics in the Democratic Party anymore, and even fewer on the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. So I think it's difficult to figure out how we restore that moral register and how we speak to religiously conservative people. But it's absolutely essential that we figure out how to do that. But I do want to get your take on coal and what you think what should be the message on coal.
Can I answer that? Is that okay with
Yeah,
folks?
go ahead.
Okay. I don't know. That's why I was asking the question. So in northeastern Pennsylvania, the coal industry developed with other industries. So you had textile mills and garment factories and everything up there my family worked in. But down in central Appalachia, bituminous coal industry did not allow other industries in. They blocked that. So that's all we got, right? And Appalachia is becoming depopulated again, especially after 5 years of bad floods. And some of those floods, the responsibility for some of those floods belongs squarely on the Tennessee Valley Authority that encouraged strip mining and mountaintop removal. So when the rains hit, people got flooded out and lost their lives and lost their livelihoods. And just here lately, we have all these people going from southern West Virginia now into North Carolina because their homes have been destroyed and they don't have clean drinking water in Wyoming and McDowell County. You can't live there now, right? And have drinking water or medical basic services. And they say they're coming back, but they're not going to, so we're losing population again. Mining's been automated to such an extent, one longwall machine takes 35 jobs and it's largely computer work, right? And in central Appalachia, the seams now are so thin that you hit silica right behind the coal, like you only have 3 inches of coal and you hit silica. And now we have black lung with guys in their 40s and 50s, whereas we used to get it in their 70s and 80s.
Mm-hmm.
It's not viable and it's not safe anymore. But how are you going to get steel and manufacturing without coal?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's the dilemma. Now, we got to stop strip mining. We got to stop mountaintop removal. Half my family would kill me if they heard me say that. But the other half would give me a big applause because they're underground miners. But how do we do that? How do we keep underground mining and not kill the rest of the planet too?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer to these questions sort of has to come from the miners themselves if we're going to be successful. Because the only people who are going to be able to convince miners to do anything that you just said are miners. It's not going to be people who have no relationship to the industry that are going to be able to make a compelling case. But a miner can make a compelling case, and I think that's part of why we need to start finding them.
It's true, but we don't have any union mines left in Illinois, and that was the cradle of our union. And we only have one prep plant organized, and I think one mine left in the union in Southwest Virginia, which, by the way, voted for Obama and took a pretty advanced position, in part because of the union, but also in part because some country singers went down there in bluegrass and primitive Baptist Universalists went out there and campaigned for him. But anyway, it's going to be hard to find those voices.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. We're going to wrap up in a couple minutes. There's good questions in the chat. And John, do you want to be the last verbal question?
John, you're muted.
You're muted, John.
Thank you. Really appreciate all that you've said, Dino. And I'm curious where you think the issue of climate change fits into your picture of progressive policies and winning people over to those policies.
Right. I mean, I think that much of the left looks at climate change as primarily a question of renewable energy. And I think to a certain extent, that vision of it limits what needs to be done. For instance, I think one of the most important things that we need to have happen is we need to build an electrical grid. not just rebuild an electrical grid, but build a unified American electrical grid, which we do not have. And if we're going to have any sustainable transition away from much of the gas powered and fossil fuel powered things, you need a sustainable electric grid, and you need one that's highly efficient. Well, that's 1 million jobs right there. It's a way to actually win people over to the question of a just transition that involves a very practical question, one that they're dealing with right now. I mean, there are outages in Texas, there are outages all over the South, repeated outages because of the way we handle energy policy and because of the fact that we have an unreliable electrical grid. So I think one major way that the left can start talking about climate politics in a way that actually appeals to people is to say, let's rebuild our electrical grid and unify it for the first time.
All right, we're going to wrap up, even though there's so much great stuff in the chat. Obviously, we could keep this amazing conversation going for a really long time, but I just want to really thank you a lot, Dina. Dino, this was very, very provocative and juicy, and it's everything you're saying is just so well thought out. And I really appreciate everybody who's asked questions and put comments in the chat. I think this is really a lively one. So you can see here that we've got the next 2 Talking Class webinars planned. This summer, we're going to do a panel with 3 of the leaders of the Working Class Studies Association, comparing ideas of what working class means over different generations, which is something that Michael Zweig has written about, and over different countries and continents, which Jeff Cabusau, our president, and Sarah Atfield, our some other officer that I'm forgetting which one, but this is 3 of the leaders of the Working Class Studies Association have all been thinking about these questions for a really long time. And then in September, we've got Joan Williams as our guest on September 18th. She's got a new book out called Outclassed, and it's very connected to this topic tonight. It's about how the left can win back the working class. I'm reading the book now. It's fascinating. So I think these are both going to be very, very juicy ones. And you can see the recordings of tonight. You'll see the recording in a few days, and of the all the past Talking Class webinars. They're all on YouTube. You can see them at classmatters.org/events. And that's also where you can register. You can register now for the July 24th one, and in a couple months you'll be able to register for September. So yeah, thanks to everybody, and especially to you, Dino. This was awesome.
Oh, no, thank you guys. I really appreciate being invited. Thanks, Betsy, and thanks, Jack, for organizing and for everybody showing up.
Yeah, I had high expectations of you, Dino, and you exceeded them. So that's pretty good.
Yeah. No, it's really incredible.